Have you ever felt uneasy listening to a song but ignored it? Not because it sounded bad, not because it was offensive, but because something in your spirit tightened and you brushed it off. You told yourself, it's just music. You told yourself, everyone listens to this. You told yourself, God doesn't care about something this small. But what if that's not true? What if the thing you've labeled harmless is quietly shaping your thoughts, your emotions, and the atmosphere of your life? The Bible is clear. What you allow in does not stay neutral. It forms you. It influences you. And over time, it directs you. This isn't about being extreme. This isn't about rejecting culture just to feel holy. This is about discernment, because not all music is just sound. Some of it carries a spirit, a message, an agenda, and you are opening yourself to it every time you press play. So today, we're not talking about preferences. We're talking about protection, the protection of your mind, the protection of your spirit, and the peace of your home. And there are certain types of music you should never allow. Asterisk. 1. Music that glorifies sin. This one seems obvious, but it's not as simple as you think, because most believers don't openly celebrate sin. They casually tolerate it through entertainment. It sounds catchy. It feels emotional. It tells a story. And before you realize it, you're repeating lyrics that celebrate things God clearly calls destructive: lust, violence, pride, rebellion, self-worship. You would never stand in a room and verbally promote those things. But you sing them. You memorize them. You let them play on repeat in your mind. It sounds harmless, doesn't it? But here's what most people miss. Repetition creates agreement. And agreement, whether you realize it or not, opens a door. The Bible warns that what comes out of your mouth matters, but what you consistently put into your mouth matters just as much, because eventually it comes back out. You cannot fill your mind with messages that glorify sin and expect your spirit to remain unaffected. You cannot normalize darkness in your ears and expect to walk in light in your life. It doesn't work that way. This is not about one song. This is about a pattern. Because when sin is constantly presented as attractive, your resistance to it weakens, slowly, quietly, subtly. You don't notice it at first, but your convictions soften, your boundaries blur, your sensitivity to God's voice becomes dull. And then one day, you're not just listening anymore, you're justifying. That's how it starts. So let me say this clearly. Do not allow music that glorifies what God has called sin to have a place in your life. Not occasionally. Not just for the vibe. Not because it's popular. Never allow it, because what you permit, you eventually become comfortable with. And what you become comfortable with, you stop resisting. Asterisk. 2. Music that distorts your identity. This point is more subtle and far more dangerous, because it doesn't always sound dark. It often sounds empowering, confident, bold, even inspiring. But the message underneath it is completely disconnected from truth. It tells you that you are self-made, that you don't need God, that your worth comes from status, attention, or control. It feeds pride, and pride is not harmless. Pride separates. It separates you from correction. It separates you from humility. And ultimately, it separates you from God. It sounds contradictory, doesn't it? Because the world calls it confidence. But confidence built on a false identity will always lead you away from truth. The Bible teaches that your identity is not something you create, it's something you receive. You are not the center. You are not the source. You are not the one in control. And music that constantly reinforces the opposite reshapes how you see yourself, even if you don't realize it. Because identity is formed through repetition. What you hear over and over again becomes the voice you start believing. And once that voice is internalized, it begins to guide your decisions. You start valuing what it values, chasing what it glorifies, rejecting what it dismisses. That's how influence works: quiet, consistent, cumulative. So when music tells you you don't need anyone, you are your own God, do whatever feels right, you need to recognize it for what it is. Not empowerment, deception. Because anything that pulls you away from dependence on God is not building you, it's misleading you. And you cannot afford to build your identity on something that contradicts truth. So do not accept it. Not because it sounds bad, but because it sounds good while leading you wrong. And that's what makes it dangerous. 3. Not best. Asterisk. 3. Music that carries emotional bondage. This is the one most people overlook, because it doesn't look sinful. It doesn't sound rebellious. In fact, it often sounds vulnerable. Sad. Broken. Emotional. And you connect with it, because it feels real. But here's the problem. Not all emotional expression leads to healing. Some of it traps you. There's music that doesn't just express pain, it glorifies it. It keeps you in it. It feeds it. It deepens it. Over and over again. You listen when you're sad, and instead of lifting you, it anchors you deeper. You start to identify with the pain. You start to replay the hurt. You start to build your emotional state around it. And slowly, your sadness becomes your identity. That is not freedom. That is bondage. The Bible never tells you to live in your pain. It acknowledges it, but it always leads you through it. But music that constantly pulls you back into emotional darkness does the opposite. It keeps the wound open. It prevents renewal. It reinforces despair. And here's where it gets serious. What you repeatedly feel, you begin to live. If your environment is constantly feeding heaviness, heartbreak, and hopelessness, your spirit will begin to mirror it. Peace becomes harder to access. Joy feels distant. Clarity becomes clouded, not because God left you, but because you surrounded yourself with a voice that keeps pulling you down. So be careful. Not every song that feels deep is healthy. Not every emotional connection is beneficial. You are responsible for what you allow to shape your inner world. And if something consistently pulls you into darkness, even subtly, do not allow it, because your emotional state is not something to play with. It affects your decisions, your relationships, your walk with God, and protecting it is your responsibility. We've already uncovered 3 types of music that quietly shape your spirit. Music that glorifies sin. Music that distorts your identity. Music that traps you in emotional bondage. And if you're honest, you've probably recognized at least one of them in your life. But now we move deeper, because the next 3 are not just about influence, they are about access. Access to your mind, access to your atmosphere, and in some cases, access to your spiritual sensitivity. This is where many believers stop discerning. This is where compromise becomes dangerous. 4. Music that desensitizes your spirit. This one doesn't hit you all at once. It works slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. Because at first you notice it. The lyrics feel off. The tone feels heavy. Something doesn't sit right. But you keep listening. And the next time it doesn't feel as strong. By the 3rd or 4th time you don't feel anything at all. That's not growth. That's desensitization. Your spirit was wanting you. Your discernment was active. But instead of responding, you overrode it. And when you repeatedly ignore conviction, you don't become stronger. You become quieter inside. This is how sensitivity to God is lost. Not in one moment, but through repeated exposure without resistance. The Bible speaks about guarding your heart. Not casually watching it, not occasionally protecting it. Guarding it. Because your heart, your inner world, is where everything flows from. And music has direct access to it. No filter, no defense, just repetition and emotion. So when you allow music that initially convicted you to become normal, you are training your spirit to stop reacting. And once that happens, you don't just lose discomfort with music. You begin to lose sensitivity to sin itself. Things that once felt wrong start to feel acceptable. Things that once bothered you no longer register. And eventually, you stop noticing when God is trying to correct you. This is serious, because a desensitized spirit is vulnerable. You cannot respond to what you no longer recognize. So hear this clearly. If something disturbed your spirit at first, pay attention to that. Do not override it. Do not explain it away. Do not normalize it. Because that initial conviction was protection. And if you silence it long enough, you may not hear it again. 5. Music that invites the wrong atmosphere. This is where it goes beyond personal preference. Because music doesn't just affect your thoughts. It shapes your environment, your room, your home, your internal atmosphere. And many people underestimate this completely. You play certain songs and suddenly your mood shifts. Your thoughts change. Your energy feels different. That's not random. That's influence. Because music carries more than sound. it carries tone, it carries intention, and sometimes it carries spiritual weight. Now be careful here. This isn't about fear. This isn't about seeing darkness in everything, but it is about awareness. Because not every atmosphere is neutral. Some music brings peace, clarity, stillness. But other music introduces agitation, aggression, restlessness. And if you consistently fill your space with that, it becomes your norm. You start feeling on edge without knowing why. You lose your sense of calm. Your mind becomes noisy. And then you try to pray, but your environment doesn't support it. Your thoughts are scattered, your focus is weak. Your spirit feels distant, and you wonder why. It's not always complicated. Sometimes it's what you've been allowing in. The Bible speaks about peace as something that can guard you, but that peace has to be protected. You cannot fill your atmosphere with chaos and expect peace to remain untouched. It doesn't stay where it's not honored. So let me ask you something. What fills your space when no one is watching? What sound defines your room? What atmosphere are you creating daily? Because your environment is not neutral, and what you consistently allow into it will eventually shape how you think, how you feel, and how you respond. So do not ignore this. Do not treat music as background noise. It is setting a tone, whether you realize it or not. And you are responsible for that tone. 6. Music that replaces your connection with God. This is the most dangerous one. Because it doesn't look wrong at all. In fact, it often feels meaningful. You turn to music when you're overwhelmed, when you're tired, when you need comfort, and instead of going to God, you go to a song. Again and again. Until music becomes your escape, your refuge, your source. It sounds harmless, but slowly it replaces something it was never meant to take, your dependence on God, because instead of processing with Him, you numb with sound. Instead of seeking clarity, you seek distraction. Instead of being still, you fill the silence. And over time, your ability to sit with God weakens. Silence becomes uncomfortable. Stillness feels unfamiliar. Prayer feels harder. Not because God moved away, but because you filled every space where He would speak. This is subtle, but it matters. Because anything that consistently replaces time, attention, or dependence on God needs to be examined, even if it feels good, even if it helps temporarily. Because temporary relief is not the same as true restoration. Music can support your life, but it should never become your source. It should never take the place of God's voice, and it should never be what you run to first. So be honest with yourself. When you feel overwhelmed, where do you go? When you feel empty, what do you reach for? When you need peace, who do you turn to? Because if music has taken that role, it's time to correct it, not gradually, not casually. Because your connection with God is not something to replace, it is something to protect. Now you see it. Not just the surface, but the pattern. Music that glorifies sin. Music that distorts your identity. Music that traps you emotionally. Music that desensitizes your spirit. Music that shapes your atmosphere. Music that replaces your connection with God. This is not random. This is not harmless. And at this point, you have a decision to make. Because once you see something clearly, you are no longer unaware. You are responsible. This is where most people stop. They agree. They feel convicted. They even say, "That's true. I need to change this." But nothing changes. Why? Because conviction without action fades quickly. You feel it in the moment. You recognize the truth, but then you go right back to what's familiar. And slowly, your sensitivity dulls again. Your awareness fades again. And you return to the same patterns, with slightly less conviction than before. This is how cycles are formed. Not through rebellion, but through delay. So hear this clearly. Delayed obedience is still disobedience. Not because God is harsh, but because truth ignored loses its effect on you. You need to remove what you've been allowing. This is the part people avoid, because it's not emotional anymore. It's practical. It's uncomfortable. And it requires a decision. You cannot pray for peace while entertaining what disrupts it. You cannot ask for clarity while feeding confusion. You cannot expect spiritual strength while allowing constant compromise. It doesn't work that way. So if you're serious about protecting your spirit, you need to remove what doesn't belong. Not analyze it endlessly, not justify it, not phase it out slowly. Remove it. That might mean deleting playlists, unfollowing artists, changing your daily habits, being intentional about what fills your environment. Yes, it's inconvenient. Yes, it might feel extreme. But protecting your spirit has never been convenient, and it was never meant to be. Because what you tolerate will always compete with what God is trying to build in you. This is not about restriction, it's about alignment. Some people hear this and immediately think, this is too much. This is controlling. This takes the joy out of life. But that perspective is backwards, because you're not being asked to lose something valuable. You're being asked to remove what's quietly damaging you. There's a difference. God does not remove things to make your life smaller. He removes things that are interfering with your ability to live in truth, clarity, and peace. And when you let go of what's misaligned, you don't lose freedom. You gain it. Because now your mind is clearer. Your spirit is lighter. Your sensitivity returns. You begin to notice things again. You begin to feel conviction again. You begin to experience peace again. Not forced, not artificial, real. Replace don't. Just remove. Here's where many people fail. They remove the wrong influences, but leave empty space. And empty space always gets filled. So if you take something out, you must replace it with something that builds you. Something that aligns with truth. Something that strengthens your spirit. Something that supports peace in your life. Because transformation is not just subtraction, it's replacement. What you listen to daily should not pull you away from God. It should reinforce your awareness of Him. It should bring clarity. It should support discipline. It should protect your inner world. And if it doesn't belong. You set the standard for your life. No one else is responsible for this. Not your friends, not your environment, not culture. You decide what you allow. You decide what you normalize. You decide what shapes your thoughts. And whether you realize it or not, you are setting a standard every single day. Through what you tolerate. Through what you repeat. Through what you keep returning to. So be honest. What standard have you been setting? Because your current state, your clarity, your peace, your discipline is not random. It reflects what you've been allowing consistently. Final warning. This is not about perfection. This is about direction. But direction requires decisions, clear ones, firm ones. Because if you continue to allow what you now recognize as harmful, it will continue to affect you. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but consistently, quietly. Until one day, you feel disconnected and don't even know why. And when that happens, you won't trace it back to something as simple as music, but it started there. With small allowances, repeated exposure, unchallenged habits. That's how influence works. Final instruction. So don't overcomplicate this. If something glorifies what is wrong, distorts who you are, pulls you into emotional darkness, weakens your sensitivity, disrupts your peace, replaces your focus on God, do not allow it. Not sometimes, not in moderation, not just occasionally. Do not allow it. Because your spirit is not designed to carry conflicting influences. And the more intentional you become about what you allow, the more stable, clear, and aligned your life becomes. You don't need more information. You need alignment. And alignment begins with what you choose to let in. Every day, every moment, every sound, choose carefully.